Sorry, my mic was on mute. I'm going to start again. Sorry for all the viewers out there. I'm just going to give a quick introduction to Michael Cohen. Sorry for the delay in this webinar. And welcome to the fourth webinar for Sustainable Cities course. This week in the fourth module, we looked into the theme of productive cities, which, although not part of the formal SDG 11 statement, is an inevitable counter to the existing inequality in cities. Today, we'll listen and interact with Michael Cohen. Michael is an urban and development policy specialist, currently serving as professor of international affairs at the New School, New York. He teaches courses on smart cities and urban values, the urban century, slums, and urban development and urban strategies. So in the interest of time, Michael, let's start this webinar. Guys, folks out there on YouTube, we're facing technical difficulties, so there'll be no video, but you can hear Michael, and please do post your questions and thoughts in the chat box. So over to you, Michael, for about 10 minutes, and then we'll start posting questions for you to answer.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm happy to join you this morning here in New York. I think the question of productive cities and the themes of inequality, as discussed in the course, are very important questions, and it's worth it to consider for a moment that the question of urban productivity was not a question that was always on the urban agenda. For many years, the urban agenda in many parts of the world was dominated by the architects. There was a lot of discussion about housing, about infrastructure, about urban poverty, but there was relatively less focused on the question of what are how are incomes generated in the city, and what is one of the main reasons why people come to the city in the first place, which is in fact for getting higher wages and higher incomes than are available in the rural areas. So I like to address this problem by talking about things at 3 or 4 different levels. The first is that there was very important research done in the 80s, which started in Lagos, Nigeria, and then later moved to Jakarta and to Bangkok, by Kushik Lee and Alex Anas, who were urban economists. And what they were doing was to ask small companies in these cities, what do they do in the absence of infrastructure? When there's no public water or sanitation, no electricity, no transportation, no garbage collection. And what they discovered was that these firms would invest in their own generators, dig their own wells, transport their workers and their garbage in private vehicles. But the cost of this very frequently amounted to something on the order in Lagos of 35% of annual fixed investment. So this is very high. What this is, in effect, is a tax imposed on these companies, which reduces profits. But the key result of this is that it reduces the capacity of companies to grow and to generate new employment. So this is a case where infrastructure constraints limited the capacity for employment generation. And if in Lagos, Nigeria, it was 35% of fixed investments. In Jakarta, it was 20%, and in Bangkok, it was 12%. So I think there's a general lesson to be learned here that infrastructure is a critical part of productivity, and that we need to understand how that really operates. The second piece of this connects productivity, the productive structure of the economy, to income distribution. And there's an important book by Mario Cimoli, Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, and the economist Dosa, saying that the productive structure of a city actually affects the income distribution. And that's, of course, logical, because if we have cities with very highly differentiated income streams and incomes for different kinds of employment, we're going to have a very different kind of distribution of revenue in the city, distribution of income. So we need to understand that the structure of salaries, whether it's in the informal or formal sector, has a direct impact on people and how this appears in society. The third kind of point about this relates to informality, because of course in many cities there's a very large proportion of the labor force actually is working in the informal sector. And I think that, you know, there have been many debates about the informal sector, virtually in all countries and in all cities. But one of the debates has to do with whether workers in the informal sector actually have access to the public infrastructure and public space and other kind of benefits that come with formality. And I think what we know from a lot of experience is that even though the informal sector workers are very ingenious in finding ways to get access to the things they need for their own production of goods and services, they pay a high cost for that. They frequently pay more for water, which they get from a private vendor than people receiving water through the tap through the formal system would pay. So there's almost like a tax on informality in many cities. And the hostility of public authorities to the informal sector is also poses a cost and a risk to the informal sector. So one of the really interesting questions is whether the informal sector can be recognized and helped instead of being discriminated against and harassed. And that's a big part. The final comment I would make in relation to this question concerns the value of the city. That is to say, the stock of infrastructure in cities and how this is an important part of whether the city is productive in the first place. And what we know is that there are very, very substantial stock of existing infrastructure which has been built in the past over many years in many cities. If we think about Calcutta or Bangalore or Mumbai or Lagos or New York or wherever we're talking about, we know that there's a very substantial stock of infrastructure. The flow of new investment in infrastructure and new facilities is a very small proportion actually of the stock. And some people have estimated it's on the order of 5% a year of the existing stock of infrastructure. So one of our challenges in keeping the city productive is to think about making sure that the stock is maintained on an adequate basis. So let me stop here, and I look forward to hearing any questions.
Thanks for that, Michael. So for the format for this webinar will be that we'll go via themes, and the first one we'll go with is migration. And on the discussion forum, we've asked the students, let's start with that question first. And it is, could you elaborate on the current global discourse on migration? And do you think it's fair and just? And what more could be done? Could you state through examples from across the world?
Okay. I didn't hear that very well, but I had read the earlier thing, so let me try to respond to that. I think we need to realize that there are very good reasons for migration, and that the flow of migration, whether people are climate migrants, whether they're migrants from conflict, whether they're migrants from unproductive rural areas, or migrants who believe that there's a better life in urban areas. In all cases, the challenge of migration is whether the city, whether the urban area actually has what might be called the absorptive capacity to deal with migrants. And how well are economies structured, and what kinds of opportunities do they actually offer to migrants? I had a conversation a couple of years ago with the vice mayor of Hamburg, Germany, who made the observation that in the past they would receive perhaps 50 migrants a month in Hamburg. But with the migration crisis in 2016 in Germany, they were getting 500 people a day. And I'm sure that there are some Asian cities where it's much more than that. So the question really is how do you expand the absorptive capacity of cities from an employment point of view and from a services point of view. And here, I think one has to really emphasize the city economy as a much more horizontally diverse economy, horizontally integrated. That if we talk about cities which are dominated by single industries, it's much more difficult to absorb new migrants and generate new positions. And so it's very important to think about the horizontality and diversity of the economy as a way to receive migration.
Right. So on the YouTube chat, Amar Karan asks, please could you add what should be the strategies towards migrants in lieu of urban planners and managers?
Well, I think that we have to understand that migration is not something that's going to be stopped. It's going to be a very important continuing part of the urban process. And so urban planners and managers need to organize themselves to expect, in fact, that there will be a constant flow of migration. And what's interesting is that not just the people need housing, water supply, and sanitation, and other kinds of services, but more importantly, in some way, they need income generation opportunities. Because if they don't have those income generation opportunities, they won't be able to take care of themselves. And local authorities rarely have the resources to take care of such flows. So I think the recognition of this is important. This could mean tracing areas of land where people can live and eventually improve their houses over time, and not just pour into the existing slums. It means more urban spatial expansion. It means thinking about low-cost services that needed to be provided. It means thinking about educating the children of migrants, making sure that they speak the languages of the city and not necessarily their own language. So I think this needs to be addressed on multiple fronts.
So our next question is, how can we reimagine the constraints on national boundaries and mobility of people, particularly in context of internationally accepted human rights?
Well, that's a very difficult question because I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in many parts of the world is the xenophobia. There's an acceptance of migration, and then there's xenophobia. And we've seen this. We're now in the United States. We're living this terrible drama with the Trump administration trying to build a crazy wall to stop immigrants from Mexico and from Central America. It doesn't make any sense at all. But when you look at what has happened in Hungary and in parts of Europe, in the reduction, in the less friendly response from Germany and other countries, I think we have to realize that there is a real conflict here between human rights of people and the attitudes of governments and societies. And so I don't have an easy answer for this one, but I think that it's probably one of the major issues facing politics today.
That's so true. Next question is, as more people migrate from agriculture to labor jobs in cities, and the city is more often than not unable to accept or to accommodate these services for new population groups who are mostly of low income category, how can cities prepare for large scale migration?
Well, as I just said, I think they have to prepare on many fronts. I think they have to think of an infrastructure response that can meet basic needs of people. I think a major share of the budget needs to be allocated for this. It probably means higher taxes in many places. It probably means central to local government transfers, financial transfers. In India, it probably means that the state planning commissions need to agree and understand that they've got to allocate more money to local governments and local bodies to respond to this. That maybe is on the infrastructure side. I think there's the social service response. I think the key point here is that if you agree, or even if you don't agree, if you recognize simply that these population flows are going to keep going on, we have to respond in a very broad way, with from social services to jobs to infrastructure.
Right. Alex would like to know, migration is increasingly being seen as an adaptation strategy rather than a coping strategy, where families migrate to cities and urban areas for better employment opportunities and a better life. However, this option is not available to all households, where due to lack of social networks, capital, there's hardly any upward social and economic mobility. Could you state any example of any government-led initiatives to ensure positive migration outcomes?
Well, the only ones that I know about have been a few in Europe. And I think there's an interesting, and this may be a little bit outdated, but for example, there was a discussion in Sweden for a while about migration with dignity, or reception with dignity, which assumed that people were going to come, they were going to stay, they needed to learn the language right away. They didn't have the local language, it would be very difficult for them to find employment in the labor market. And so I think there really has to be a strategic response which assumes that people are going to stay. It's not going to be a question of they're going to arrive and be sent back. So I think, I don't really know very many examples, but I do know that we're all experiencing these things. Recently in Mexico, with Mr. Trump's wall, the Mexican government became a lot more flexible in providing services and even employment opportunities for Central American migrants who are trying to get into the United States. So I think there is flexibility if governments will only recognize that they're facing these kinds of problems.
That's so true. Even on the discussion forum, we were checking it out yesterday. One of our students wrote that he was a migrant twice, once in the 90s and once recently. And he said in America, at least, they were more welcoming in the 90s and not so much right now. And there was a big discussion on that later. So in the interest of time, now we'll move on to next questions on inequality. So there were a lot of discussions on the forum on the need to talk more on inequality. And in that vein, could you talk about ways in which income inequality manifests in urban areas and how does that affect life in cities?
Right. Well, going back to my earlier comment about this book by Cimoli and Stiglitz, and how the productive structure of a city affects income distribution. There's been research done on cities which are what might be called company towns, cities which are dominated by one or more industries. And what you learn in that is that there's a stratification of income opportunities based on the structure of the industry, right? And so the people at the top are making a lot more than the manual laborers or laborers at the bottom. And then different skill levels receive different employment. But that is a very constrained model, and what it really leads to is high levels of inequality in the so-called company town. What we know, and there is good research in Brazil which shows that, for example, in São Paulo state, when there are opportunities of a horizontal nature, where there's not one industry dominating the town, but many different kinds of economic opportunities, you have a better income distribution, a more equal income distribution. The other advantage of that is that a more varied economic structure allows for less risk to the economy, less risk from external shocks. So I think we have to welcome and embrace the idea of diverse urban economies and think about that rather than seek higher efficiency by more vertical integration.
Right. In the same vein, could we probably take this discussion into SDGs and what sort of challenges in achieving SDGs towards production of sustainable, like sustainable production and consumption patterns could we see in terms of income inequalities?
Sure. Yeah. From my view, the major characteristic of the SDGs is their interdependence. That is to say, 12 of the 17 SDGs will have to be implemented in cities. And what that means is, frankly, I'm very disappointed by SDG 11, which is supposed to be the urban SDG, but it misses three very important concepts. It misses productivity, it misses inequality, and it misses poverty. Those are found in the other SDGs, but I think they also belonged in SDG 11. Nonetheless, we have a situation where there's a high degree of interdependence in these things. And so what this calls for is a kind of urban practice, which is different. The SDGs are dominated by a discussion of the what to do, but they're almost silent on the how. This also applies to the urban agenda, the new urban agenda. I think both documents are very weak on the implementation side. And so I think we have to kind of approach these questions from the issue of what is urban practice? How can urban practice itself be less in silos and be more interdisciplinary, more integrated? And how can people learn to work across problems and not just become buried in one problem?
There's also issues of marginalized people suffering more in implementation of these policies. And would you know of any examples where inclusive policies were implemented and worked in achieving sustainable production and consumption patterns?
Right. I think let me return to a principle that I think is very important, which gets back to the how question, which is we all believe, I think, that the process of how we work affects the outcome. I think how we work, this focus on the how opens up a whole new area of inquiry. And my view is that the urban professions as a group have made a big mistake, that we have been in the business of establishing categories, which in fact are categories of exclusion. So we talk about formal and informal, legal and illegal, people included within the area, those excluded within outside. And if you add in other kinds of distinctions, whether it's race or ethnicity or caste, many of these things, we have accepted a level of discrimination and categorization of populations, which actually create barriers in and of themselves. So I think we need a way of thinking about how we work, which is much more focused on the question of inclusion. And that requires thinking from the beginning that how policies and programs actually are bringing people together. We're working on an interesting project in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, in a slum of about 40,000 people, in which maybe 20% are Argentines and 30% are Bolivians, and another 30% are from Paraguay, and another 20% or so from Peru. And these groups, they all speak Spanish, but they look differently. They have different customs, different cultures. And the really interesting challenge is how do you integrate these populations? How do you build forms of participation which get them talking to each other? And it's a big issue. But if our objective is simply putting people in housing and providing the water and these things, but rather trying to building community, then I think our process, our how, is different than it used to be.
Right. Would you know of any women-led initiatives from grassroots level for things like this?
Well, I think there are. I mean, in Latin America, there have been a number of important initiatives in Peru, in Bolivia, some in Brazil, some in Argentina, in which people are trying to work across the differences between people and being explicit about it. And it doesn't always work, but I think that this is an important area that needs a lot of attention. As long as we have cities where there's high levels of social exclusion, I think everybody loses. And it can lead to more and more xenophobia and more conflict. So it's very much related to the migration question that we talked about before.
Right. So regarding your introduction that we didn't have time to read on this webinar, we had a few questions about if you could state examples from your research on experience that the impact that international aid has in developing countries.
I'm sorry, this is breaking up. I can't hear you. I can't hear very well.
Could you give examples from your research and experience?
I just caught the last bit of it.
Okay. Do you want me to repeat it again?
If you could, I'm sorry. Yeah, I couldn't hear.
Yeah, no problem. So sorry about these technical difficulties. Could you give examples from your research and experience on the impact that international aid has in developing countries?
Right. Many years ago, I worked for a long time on international aid when I was working in the World Bank. And in 2000, I published an article which said that there were projects that the World Bank had financed in 7,000 urban areas in the developing world. And if you add in the other bilaterals and the development banks, there's another 4,000. So between 1970 and 2000, there were projects in 11,000 cities and towns. And you would have thought that that would have a very substantial impact. Right? It seems like a big number. But in fact, what happened is that the focus of these aid projects were on outputs, on building the schools, on building the housing, on putting the water in place. But there was very little attention to the outcomes, to the long-term results. And what we found is that in many places, the long-term results have not been satisfactory, right? That there has not been enough attention to the institutional frameworks, to the urban local bodies working on these, responsible for managing these projects, or maintaining these projects, or maintaining the services. So part of the question here is, can we develop strategies that have a longer time frame, that believe that outcomes are really what are important and not the outputs? And here I would say that this requires a real change in thinking in order to focus more on these outcomes. In the present time, there are many big cities, Manila, Jakarta, Calcutta, Delhi, others, where there are projects, there are too many projects in the city. There are projects which are not connected with each other. And so in some sense, the whole is less than the sum of its parts. And it's an inefficient way to manage resources, and it complicates the lives of local institutions. So I think we need to be much more strategic about how international aid can be more helpful. What I would say, kind of in a summary way, is that more aid is not enough. We don't need more aid. What we need is better aid, better design, and better focused aid.
Right. That was our last question for tonight. Michael, thank you so much for your time, and apologies for the technical difficulties, but thank you for being game about calling us on phone and taking this forward. And thank you for everything, and hope you catch your next meeting.
Thank you very much. I apologize for my inability dealing with the technology. I'm sorry.
So,
okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Good luck. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So guys, thank you so much for tuning in, and hope this was an informative webinar. We sincerely apologize for all the technical difficulties. Usually happens with international professors, but we encourage you to start a discussion with your peers on the discussion forum, and also write to us at cities@sdgacademy.org for any queries or clarifications. You'll find a recording of this webinar under the weekly module tab. And thank you again for your participation, and we'll see you again in the next webinar. Good evening.